Erev Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Haazinu, the penultimate Parsha of the Torah. And I hope that everyone had a meaningful and uplifting High Holy Days. I hope that we all feel renewed and determined to continue the work that we started 40 days ago at the beginning of Elul, and looking forward to Sukkot on Tuesday, or Tuesday and Wednesday, if those of you don't live here in Israel. Haazinu is a really very remarkable parsha. The song or the poem that is the major part of, makes up the major part of it, is one that lays out what the Torah describes as the fundamental dynamic of Jewish history. It's not a happy story. It's a story of, what shall I say? It's a story of ingratitude, of forgetting God, of being reminded under very, very bad circumstances of what it means to forget God and to forget the grace that He gave us. Whether it's a question of going out of Egypt, whether it's a question of allowing us or helping us to survive, or making it possible for us to survive in the desert, and in the desert of the exile for so many millennia, and with an ultimately positive ending that God will, in the end, even though we'll know hard times as a result of our ingratitude, we'll end up making sure that we survive. I want to every single line here has, I say this every week, every single line here is so pregnant with meaning. It's interesting that at the end of the last week's parsha, the end of the Parshat Vayelech, the Torah demands that all Jews learn Shirat Haazinu by heart. And there was a practice. We didn't do it in my school, but in many schools, little kids are taught to know Haazinu by heart. Even though that verse, as I think I mentioned last week, is the verse, the same verse as the one that is understood by tradition to mean to write. Everybody should write their own Sefer Torah and study it. But all right, that's another issue. I want to focus in on a verse which I don't think is often emphasized, and it speaks to me personally because it's one that speaks directly to the things that I've done for my entire life, which is to be a Jewish historian and to study Jewish history. And I believe that in a very profound sense, in a very real sense, the verse involved lays out a mandate for us to know our history, but in a very unique and very specific way. So the pasuk is Zechor Yemot Olam Binu Shnot V'dor V'dor. Remember the days of old. Examine or derive understanding or come to understand the years of every generation. Sha'al avicha v'yagedcha. Ask your father, and he will tell you. Zekeinecha v'yomru your elders, and they will tell you. Now, it's interesting that up until the 19th century, the traditional way of understanding these verses, these lines, I should say, it's one verse. These lines is that we should talk to the prophets, and we should go and look to we should look at the earliest generations that are described in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and Abraham, and all kinds of stuff leading up to the Exodus from Egypt. In the 19th century, however, you get a shift, and all of a sudden, commentators see in these lines a mandate to study Jewish history per se. Okay, we're going to call it post-biblical Jewish history as well. So, for example, Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch writes as follows in his commentary. He says, "Zechor Yemot Olam Binu Shnot Dor Vador." Remember the days of old of old or of yore, and derive understanding or try to understand the daily generations. He says that these are epochs. We're not talking about days. We're talking about epochs. We're talking about eras. And he says, yes, the original intention might have been to the generation of Adam and Enosh and the flood and so on, but it really comes down to the entire, as mankind unfolds, as the history of mankind unfolds, as the history of the Jewish people unfolds over the centuries. Shal avicha v'yagedcha, he says, ask your father and he will tell you, Sha'al et avicha la historia shelcha. Ask your father about your history, which is again begins in the time of the Migdal Bavel, in the Tower of Babel, because every nations began to be formed, or tribal nations begin to be formed. Then, and he'll tell you, because it's still because he was a living witness to that. It's a little strange. I mean, even in time of Moses, I mean the story of the Tower of Babel or the ziggurat was long before. So what does he mean? He'll tell you as if it were still as it is still enmeshed in his heart. He says, and you go to your elders, which means the scholars, and they will explain to you the meaning of your history. They will understand. They will teach you its sources. They will teach you your mission in life, your historical mission, in the context of all of the changings of epochs and historical change. In other words, Reb Shimon Hirsch is saying that if you want to understand what your place is in the world, what your religious mission is, you have to understand it not in terms of you per se, but you have to understand it in terms of your historical context, where you come from, and the world in which you live. In addition, the way that you relate to that history is as if you tell it to your father, and your father's telling you stories about his life. Now, but he wasn't there at Migdal Bavel. He wasn't there at Yetziat Mitzrayim. So what does that mean? So here I think we return yet again, and I've mentioned this a number of times, we return yet again to an insight where actually religious anthropologists and Rav Soloveitchik come together in agreement, is that the way that we look at history is unique in our day, meaning that that as opposed to something which happened a zillion years ago and who cares, and the history is dead, and historians and archaeologists, for example, are sort of pathologists of the past. For us, for a Jew, there's no such thing as a dead past. For us, the past is living. When your father describes Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's as if he were there, so that you can be infected with this idea of this, not infected in a bad sense, but in other words, it can be, you can learn how to transcend the limits of your time and space to be able to experience the past so that it's imminent in your own life and formative in your own life. You associate and you identify with the figures of the past and the events of the past as if they happen right now. And that doesn't matter whether it's good things, like for most of us, the establishment of the State of Israel, or Yetziat Mitzrayim way back when, or the return to Zion after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or whatever it was, or the bad times, or the destruction of the Temple, or the Crusades, or the expulsion from Spain, or whatever it is. It's all immediate. We identify with it. It's as if it was now, because those memories, not far from being a burden, they make us who we are, so we can better understand ourselves, because the long durée, as they say in the Annals School of Historiography, the long view is exactly how we look at the world and how we can survive. I'm not going to be short in words here. The truth of the matter is that part of the major crisis of Jewish self-identification, doesn't matter whether it's in Israel or whether it's or whether it's in the diaspora, is the fact that there is woeful ignorance, among other things, of Jewish history and knowing where we come from, what we and what we stand for, except for the Shoah. And I'm sorry, how they kill us is not sufficient. Is not sufficient cause. It's important, but that's not the whole story. You have to also know about the world that we had, and we'll discover the things that we still do, whether we know it or not, whether we're religious or not religious. Many of the things that happened, and the ways of life that went before, whether they were in the Mediterranean basin and the Arab countries, or whether it was in Christian Europe, still impact on the way that we look at the world. It's an ongoing our history and our collective memory is an ongoing living enterprise. There was another rabbi who said exactly the same thing, even in more emphatic terms. His name was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes. He was a student of history. He didn't get a PhD, but he was a trained historian as well as being a phenomenal rabbinic scholar and public figure. And in the introduction to one of his books, which is called Darchei Hora'ah, the ways of actually adjudicating halakha of all things, he writes, and I'm going to translate free. This is a free translation. He says, and I know that the responsibility for the harming of our generation is actually the ones who are responsible for it are the rabbis of our time. Why? What would they do? He says, because all they taught was Gemara. All they taught was halacha. Now that's critical. How else are you going to know how to do mitzvahs? And that's Talmud Torah. However, it is critically necessary. It is critically necessary for us to know our own history, especially in a world which is historicist, especially in a world where history is constantly thrown up to us. It's not enough to know the laws of Shabbat when, in fact, those who would deny our right to the land of Israel, those who would deny the fact that we are a people, even if those who don't live in the land of Israel, if we don't know how to respond to that and say, no, we were a people, and I can prove it because there's this and this and this and this and this. And trust me, there are proofs. He said that we're leaving people stranded out there. As the tsunami of criticism of Jewish continuity and of Jewish ethnic and national identity are called into question, and similar questions and similar challenges to those posed to us today were asked then in the 19th century. We have to arm ourselves, not just the rabbis, to arm ourselves to know our own history, to be able to respond, because each one of us represents the Jewish people in all of our ways of life and all of our walks of life, and that is certainly true also in Israel, because unfortunately, the amount of history that the average Israeli knows is minimal. I have a course that I give every year at Bar Ilan, which is the history of the interaction between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And I insist that the class has got to include both people who come from religious high schools and secular high schools for a very simple reason, because they're all equally ignorant to the same degree. So they should all get together. We should all do this together. This enterprise of discovery. However, there is an added element. There's an added element to the way that we look at history and the way we should understand the annals of our people, which is not obtained, which shouldn't obtain, in the academy. In other words, Jewish studies per se is not necessarily Torah, and not necessarily even constructive for the formation of Jewish identity. Number one, I mean, it can be, but not necessarily. Number one, history, especially in the way that it's carried out today, is atheist, materialist, and heavily neo-Marxist. meaning that there's a tendency not to, especially at least among Jewish historians, not to grant people the integrity of religious integrity, that they act according to their ideals. There's always sort of the sense of, no, they did it because they were interested, or they had some reason to do it. They were influenced from the outside. There's a general tendency among many Jewish historians to assume, Jews never came up with anything original. Everything was always an influence from the outside. We just, we're sort of a function. We're sort of like a Zelig or a Protean people that sort of take on the colors of wherever we are. Now, of course, there's interaction with every people, but it doesn't mean that there's not some kind of essential something Jewish that is continuously extant through the ages. But that's what the way that history is presented. We don't, as people of faith, and this doesn't violate the facts of history at all, understand the fact that history is also, and that's what Haazinu is trying to tell us, is the story of divine providence acting behind the curtains, acting behind the scenes, and calling the shots. Sometimes it's not clear why. Clearly, there's certainly terrible things that happen. We don't understand why. But by the same token, certainly there are other times that we can see God's hand in history, and that's also a form of causality. It's also that's really the mandate. You see God's hand in history in the way that we can survive despite everything. That makes knowing the annals of our people a form of Torah. And Rav Shamshon for all Hirsch is saying we can find out we can only understand the reason why we were born into a certain specific time and what our personal or group mission is by understanding the context in which we were born. Rav Soloveitchik is to say that every single person, he echoes Rav Kook here, every single person is born in a specific time, in specific circumstances, with specific talents, and his challenge is to discover what his or her mission is, and to try to realize that mission. That's what history is for. Finally, the faith that God ultimately is the author of history, even as he hides his face, we talked about this last week, is really the ticket as to try to understand our own survival. And therefore, Zechor Yemot Olam Binu Shnot Dor Vador, in the case of the Shirat Haazinu writ large, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to the people, or God through Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to the people, and to every Jew in every generation, there are dynamics that are set in the way that we relate to the world and the way the world relates to us. That arrogance and self-satisfaction and taking full credit for all of our achievements without understanding that it was God who was responsible ultimately only leads to disaster. I'm always very scared when Israeli leaders sit there and say, "Well, we did this and we did this." Yeah, we were the effective causes. We did do stuff, but as a believing person, that's that kind of arrogance and that kind of arrogating of power and influence to ourselves is fraught, to put it lightly. The point of Binushnot Dor Vador Sha'ar Levicha V'Yigecha Zekinecha B'Yomrulach, look at the ages that came before, see how they acted, see how they, when they acted properly, they acted properly. When they made the mistake of being too self-centered and getting distance from their values and making themselves understood the entire story, I have to learn that lesson as well. So that is, the bottom line is, it means is also that in the proper modality, again, without fudging, we're not fudging facts here. There is, I believe, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. There is a kiyum of Talmud Torah in the study of Jewish history, and to discern between the lines. And on the other side of the lattice is God's presence and God's direction. Okay, Shavuot. So, Gemar Tov, and we will speak Mirz Hashem during Chol HaMoed. Chag Sameach to everyone. Enjoy Sukkot, Zman Simchatenu, and we will see you next time.